Welcome. My name is Christopher Wolf. I'm president of the American Public Philosophy Institute, which is sponsoring this event. The APPI was established in 1989, bringing together an interdisciplinary group of scholars committed in various ways to the broad Aristotelian Thomistic natural law tradition, with the goal of giving that tradition a more salient voice in current scholarly discussions and public discourse. It sponsors scholarly activities, public lectures, regional and national student conferences. In recent years, since 2014, it's focused its activities especially at the University of Dallas, which is a naturally congenial home for it. Let me briefly explain what the APPI is all about. Its mission is to promote a natural law public philosophy rooted in the principles of the American founding, one that pursues freedom and prosperity, grounded on the moral integrity of the culture and our social and political institutions. Let me break that down a little bit. What's natural law? Natural law is really the objective moral order, at least the basic principles of which natural law theorists argue all men know, and from which they can derive further principles to guide specific moral choices. What is a public philosophy? Every nation has to make decisions about how to act as a political community, how to act in foreign affairs, what the responsibilities of governments for social welfare are, the place of the family in society, and how government should relate to it. What's the relationship between our social life and the broadest and most fundamental questions of human life, such as religion? The answer to these questions reflect or embody a certain understanding of politics and of human life more generally, especially an understanding of the ends and the nature of the human person. The complex web of assumptions, beliefs, convictions that make up this understanding can be described as a nation's public philosophy. This public philosophy is a touchstone of legitimacy. It shapes what we think it's legitimate or even necessary for government or society to do. It involves us to some significant extent in some kind of shared way of looking at life, at reality, with a special attention to political and social realities. The principles of a nation's public philosophy are also, at any given time, clear on some things and obscure on others. They're constantly being contested, challenged, reshaped. Public philosophy can evolve for better or for worse. The APPI sponsors activities that call for reflection on important political and social issues, perhaps especially issues on which there are deep differences in America today, the resolution of which will shape what America's public philosophy is and what it will become. We hope to equip students and others who attend our events to think about both concrete issues and about the underlying conceptions of human life, what it means to be a human being, and especially a good human being, that are reflected in our public life and debates. And today we want to have a discussion. We've brought in a speaker to speak on something that's really central to American political discussion today and has been really throughout our history, and that is the issue of race. You know, some of you are familiar with different parts of Tocqueville's Democracy in America. You know that Tocqueville talked about the three races and speculated about the future of the three races in America in the future, and did not have optimistic views about the future, which of course were borne out by the Civil War and then of course what happened subsequently. Nowadays our nation is deeply divided on racial issues, on exactly what the nature of the problem is, how much the problem is rooted in especially the history of slavery and then Jim Crow in the United States. And I think any person of goodwill in our society needs to recognize that the racial issue in our society is in no sense resolved. That I think a person of goodwill also ought to recognize that there have been significant advances in my lifetime in the relationship between the two races and racial equality. And yet there's not a sense of that in the public world today. I mean, we don't feel a great level of satisfaction about what the state of racial issues are today. So with this as background, I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Jason Riley as our speaker today. He's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, where he's worked for more than 20 years, writing opinion pieces on politics, economics, education, immigration, and race. He's appeared as a commentator for Fox News for over a decade. In 1918, he received the Bradley Prize for his courageous and thoughtful analysis of controversial topics, as well as for his promotion of ideals of freedom and prosperity. He's the author of Let Them In, The Case for Open Borders, 2008. And that reminds me to let you know that a week from Friday, the APPI will be sponsoring a seminar on immigration principles, from Friday night, September 27th to 6 p.m. Saturday the 28th. You'll see advertising around campus for that. So he wrote a book, Let Them In, which argues for a more free market-oriented U.S. immigration policy. In 2014, he wrote, Please Stop Helping Us, How Liberals Make It Harder for Blacks to Succeed, which discusses the track record of government efforts to help the black underclass. His most recent book, False Black Power, 2017, is an assessment of why black political success has not translated into more economic success. He holds a BA in English from SUNY Buffalo, and the APPI is delighted to have him here speaking today.
So books on immigration and race. As you can see, I like the easy topics, the ones that bring us together as a country. Thank you for that introduction, Professor, and thanks to the APPI for inviting me, and all of you for coming out this evening. And I do mean that. I do appreciate this. I've been speaking on college campuses for a long time, but I've learned these days not to take these invitations for granted anymore. Given the climate on some campuses these days, you really can't do that. Some of you might know that the University of Chicago now sends out a letter to incoming freshmen that explains the school's commitment to academic freedom and how they do not support trigger warnings or safe spaces or cancel invited speakers because of topics they might prove to be controversial. That used to go without saying on college campuses. Now it needs to be stated explicitly in writing to incoming freshmen, which says something about where we are today. I think college ought to be a place where students are exposed to different points of view, where their sensibilities are challenged, where they learn to grapple with alternative perspectives and formulate coherent responses to those perspectives. And on a lot of campuses today, that's just not happening to the extent that it should be happening. So it's good to know that schools like the University of Dallas continue to challenge students to think outside of their comfort zones, and I'm, again, very grateful to be here. I thought I'd spend a few minutes talking about social inequality in America today, particularly racial inequality, and the role that politics plays in addressing it. It's a topic that's on the minds of a lot of people these days, including some presidential candidates who have even called for slavery reparations for blacks to address these inequities. It's also a theme I explored in the book the professor mentioned, my most recent book, False Black Power, which started out as a column and then grew into a longer essay and eventually a short book. And I wrote it shortly after President Obama left office, and my intention was to make a fairly simple point, which is that President Obama needed black voters much more than they needed him. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that political activity is not the most effective method of advancing a group economically. A racial or ethnic group's political success does not automatically translate into economic success. One does not flow naturally from the other. It's hardly an original observation, but it's an important one that I think is regularly ignored by civil rights activists and others who practice what's sometimes called identity politics. That is, urging blacks and other minorities to vote as a bloc, favor candidates of their own racial or ethnic background, and so forth. And I thought the end of the Obama administration was an especially good time to re-examine this strategy, which has been in place for more than 50 years now. Since the 1960s, black leaders have really prioritized the integration of political institutions with the goal of closing racial and economic gaps in society. And at least in terms of electing blacks to office, the strategy has been successful. By the early 1980s, major U.S. cities with large black populations, your Clevelands, your Detroits, your Chicagos, Washington, Philadelphia, and so forth, had elected black mayors. Since 1970, the number of black elected officials has grown from fewer than 1,500 to more than 10,000, including, of course, a black president, all inside of 50 years. In addition, we've seen a proliferation of black police chiefs and school superintendents and council members and state legislatures and congressmen. The problem is that all of this political clout hasn't really paid off economically for the black poor, which is what we were told would happen. You look at how the black underclass fared in Coleman Young's Detroit in the 1970s, or Marion Barry's Washington, D.C. in the 1980s, or Sharp James's Newark, New Jersey in the 1990s. These were black mayors who created these unbeatable political machines in the name of helping the black poor. Yet the poor became even more impoverished on their watch. Mississippi has long boasted more black elected officials than any other state in the nation, yet it also continues to have one of the highest black poverty rates in the nation. Or you look at case studies of places like Atlanta in the 1970s and 80s, where under black mayors, the city implemented racial preference policies for hiring black city workers and contractors. And under these policies, blacks who were already better off, such as the business owners, did just fine. But average income blacks were left behind, and the black poor actually lost ground during this period. And that's been the story not just in places like Atlanta, but nationwide. In an era of increasing black political clout, not to mention affirmative action and racial set-asides, the black underclass has lost ground, both in absolute terms and relative to the white underclass in this country. In the 1970s and 80s, and even well into the 1990s, the poorest blacks in America saw their incomes decline at more than double the rate of the poorest whites in America. So, in an era of unprecedented growth in the number of black elected officials, the black poor has regressed. Their situation has actually worsened. Now, yes, as the professor mentioned, gains have been made over the decades. On balance, blacks are certainly better off than they were a half century ago. But the track record regarding the black poor is appalling. It's clear that government policies, whether they're implemented by white or black politicians, aren't the solution to many of these problems that blacks face. It's clear that the Great Society government programs of the 1960s may have been very well intentioned, but they aren't getting the job done in terms of reducing racial inequality that everyone complains so much about. So what's going on here? The short answer, judging from history, in my reading of it at least, is that blacks ultimately have to help themselves. These problems aren't necessarily political and won't necessarily lead themselves to political solutions, regardless of the color of the politician. or a public policymaker, for that matter. Ultimately, blacks will have to do what other groups have done, and that is develop what economists refer to as human capital. Attitudes, habits, behaviors that other groups developed in order to rise in America. And to the extent that a government policy, however well-intentioned, interferes with this essential self-development, it risks doing more harm than good. History shows that there aren't any shortcuts when it comes to developing this human capital. Open-ended welfare benefits do not help a group develop a work ethic, which is ultimately what they must develop in order to rise out of poverty and stay out of poverty. Soft on crime laws make ghettos more dangerous for the mostly law-abiding residents who live there, and they make life easier for the criminals who primarily prey on the black poor. Racial preferences and college admissions mismatch students with schools, which results in lower black graduation rates and fewer black professionals than we would have in the absence of these policies, and so on. Yet these policies have been pushed to help narrow inequality. In practice, they've exacerbated it. Now, this history should have served to temper expectations for our first black president, without taking away anything from Barack Obama's historic accomplishment, or the country's widespread sense of pride in the racial progress that his election represented and symbolized. The reality is that there was little reason to believe that a black president was the answer to racial inequities or the problems of the black poor, or that electing more black presidents or senators or governors will be the answer going forward. Under Obama, black-white gaps in household income and poverty and home ownership and other measures all widened. The job situation for blacks did improve toward the end of his second term, but blacks didn't see their average unemployment rate fall below double digits until the third month of Obama's 7th year in office. So now we have more evidence that the proliferation of black politicians in recent decades, including a twice-elected black president, has done little to narrow racial gaps in employment, income, home ownership, academic achievement, and other areas. Now, this is not to say that blacks should not run for office or engage politically. I'm not saying that. What I'm questioning is whether gaining political influence should continue to play such a central role in efforts to help blacks advance, or whether black leaders and others interested in addressing racial inequality would do better to focus their attention elsewhere. Nor am I suggesting that the Obama presidency caused these gaps to widen necessarily. History shows that racial inequality has widened under white mayors and white governors and white presidents too. What I am suggesting is that the belief that a black president would make a huge difference in racial inequality in and of itself was misplaced. What I'm suggesting is that economic advancement and political advancement are two very different things, and that any serious discussion of inequality in this country must include a discussion of other differences, including differences in culture. Prior to the 1960s, in the first half of the 20th century, when blacks were more focused on developing this human capital, we saw racial gaps narrowing in income, in academic achievement, in black representation in middle-class professions, and elsewhere. Blacks were not only making gains in absolute terms, they were gaining on whites. Racial gaps were narrowing during this period. But following the government interventions in the 1960s and the black leadership's decision to shift much of their focus to attaining political power, those previous gains slowed, stalled, or in some cases even reversed course. Let me offer some examples of what I'm talking about. For the first half of the 20th century and well into the 1950s, black marriage rates in the U.S. were either similar to white marriage rates or higher. In the 1940s and 50s, black labor participation rates exceeded those of whites. Black incomes grew much faster than white incomes, and the black poverty rate fell by 40 percentage points. Between 1940 and 1970, so we're talking about during the Jim Crow era of segregation and prior to the era of affirmative action, the number of blacks in middle-class professions, your accountants and engineers and school teachers and social workers and lawyers, the number of blacks in these professions quadrupled during this period. Between 1960 and 1970 alone, black incomes in the U.S. doubled. They rose for whites during this decade as well, but not as fast as they were rising for blacks. In other words, during this period, racial gaps were not just narrowing, but narrowing in some cases quite rapidly. Steady progress was being made. It was being made during a time of rampant racism in this country, and it was being made when blacks had very little political clout. Blacks were making progress because the focus was on developing human capital, which is far more important than electing black politicians. As I said earlier, Obama needed blacks to win the White House. But the idea that black Americans need a black president to prosper in this country is not something supported by the historical record. I think what's too often missing from most of today's discussions about this inequality, whether we're talking about employment or education or incarceration, income, or other measures, is the role that culture plays. Discussing antisocial behavior in poor black communities and suggesting that such behavior plays a significant role in racial inequality has become almost taboo. A few years ago, I wrote a column for the Wall Street Journal on the prevalence of violent crime in poor black neighborhoods. And in the column, I used a quote from Martin Luther King, who once said to a black congregation, "Do you know that Negroes are 10% of the population in St. Louis and responsible for 58% of the crimes?" King said, "We've got to face that. We've got to do something about our moral standards." He said, "We know that there are many things wrong in the white world, but there are many things wrong in the black world too. We can't keep on blaming the white man. There are things we must do for ourselves." Now, after the column ran, a number of readers contacted the paper and said on Twitter that I had made up the quote, which comes from a 1961 profile of King written by the famous black author James Baldwin in Harper's Magazine. Now, I was a little surprised by this reaction because all you have to do these days is Google the quote to find the source. But what really struck me about the accusation is that those making it apparently just couldn't believe that the nation's most prominent civil rights leaders used to speak this way about problems in the black community and the role of personal responsibility. Now, King was obviously a uniquely gifted and capable leader, and I'm not suggesting that black people today need another Martin Luther King. They don't. What I'm suggesting is that King represented a type of leadership, a type of thinking, a good faith approach to closing racial divisions that politicians and social activists today barely even give lip service to. King and his generation of leaders believed that whites obviously had a role to play in changing a fundamentally racist system, but they also understood that blacks had a role to play, and they were willing to hold blacks accountable despite the white racism, the legal and rampant white racism that existed at the time. They operated under the belief and tried to instill in other young people the belief that blacks must succeed notwithstanding these racial barriers, that blacks can't sit around waiting for whites to get their act together first. There's no time for that. Again, as King put it, we can't keep on blaming white people for our problems. There are things we must do for ourselves. Now contrast that with what you hear coming from activists today and politicians. people who express concern about the plight of the black underclass. Today, they spend much more time making excuses for the behavior that King and other leaders of that era regularly condemned. Young black kids are sent out into the world with a chip on their shoulders these days. They're told the cops are gunning for them. Their teachers are racist. The tests are racist. The employers are racist. The judges and prosecutors and entire criminal justice system is stacked against them. They're told that the world owes them, and if they don't succeed, it's not their fault. So at a time when young blacks today are far more likely to experience racial preferences than racial prejudice, at a time when you have a generation of blacks who came of age with a twice-elected black president, we have people in positions of influence and authority insisting that blacks can't be held in any way responsible for these persistent racial gaps until white racism has been essentially vanquished from America. In many cases, you're dealing with black leaders and activists who consider any focus on black responsibility or accountability to be itself a form of racism. And the academic and political and media establishment, for the most part, play right along. This discussion of race and crime today, which I'm going to talk about for a little bit, to me is a perfect example of the phenomenon. In the media, and I have to indict my own profession in this, but also on college campuses. In the media on college campuses, among civil rights activists and political figures, even in the world of sports, a fundamentally dishonest narrative has taken hold. The press is very eager to break down police shootings by race, but hesitant to break down criminal behavior by race, which gives the public a very distorted picture of what is actually happening. Study after study, going back decades, has shown that blacks are arrested and incarcerated at higher rates than whites based on behavior. Now, that doesn't mean that there are no racist cops or police who abuse their authority, but it's clear that racism in and of itself is an inadequate explanation for the higher rates of arrests and incarceration among blacks. Now, there's no complete national database on police shootings. Some police departments report more extensive data than others. And perhaps some uniform system should be put in place. I certainly have no objection to that. But the data we do have show that in a typical year, police are involved in approximately 2 to 3% of black shooting deaths in this country. 2 or 3%. In the first half of 2016, for example, there were about 2,100 shootings in Chicago. Out of those 2,100, 9 involved police. 9 out of 2,100. Over the course of the entire year, there were more than 4,300 shootings in Chicago. Almost all of the shooting victims were black, and 99.5% of the shootings were carried out by civilians, not police. During one weekend in Chicago last year, 74 people were shot in one weekend. One of the local hospital emergency rooms had to shut down because there was no room for any more bodies. Again, none of these shootings involved cops, not one. Young black men in Chicago or Baltimore or Washington, D.C., or Oakland or Houston or other large inner cities may indeed leave the house every day worried about getting shot, but not by police. But you'd never know this following the media coverage. Back in New York City, where I'm based, we have the nation's largest population and the nation's largest police force. And it just so happens that the New York City Police Department has kept detailed records of police shootings, going all the way back to 1971. That year, police shot 314 people, 91 of them fatally. 2 decades later, the number of police shootings in New York had fallen from 314 to 108, and fatalities had fallen from 93 to 27. The most recent numbers available for New York come from 2017. In 2017, New York City police shot 19 people, 10 of them fatally, the lowest number on record. So we're talking about a roughly 90% reduction in police shootings and police shooting fatalities in the nation's largest city with the nation's largest police force over the past 4.5 decades. And New York is no outlier here. Police shootings have fallen dramatically nationwide in other major cities over the past half-century. In 2017, police in Los Angeles, which is the nation's second largest city, shot 15 people. And police in Chicago, our third largest city, shot 25 people, which represented less than 1% of all shootings in Chicago that year. Meanwhile, we have social activists claiming that police shootings are not only rising, but have reached epidemic proportions. This is just one of many examples of how a prevailing narrative can be almost completely divorced from the empirical data. But if we want to begin to do something about racial inequities, we need to be honest with ourselves. We need to correct the false narratives that so often drive the discussion. According to federal figures, police shootings of black people have fallen by more than 70% nationwide in the past 50 years, since 1970. This idea of trigger-happy cops out there today systematically gunning for young black men, based on everything we know, is a myth. Yet we have entire movements today advancing this narrative, and the media expressing next to no skepticism. We have pro-athletes refusing to stand for the national anthem in protest of cops targeting young black men. They think there's some epidemic going on out there. It's a narrative that's gained tremendous currency based on anecdotal evidence, based on social media videos that have gone viral, but no empirical data support this narrative. We've reached a point where the facts don't seem to matter. All that matters is controlling the narrative. The media would have you believe that the main problem in our inner cities is policing. But the sad reality is that blacks are only about 13% of the population in this country, yet commit more than half of all homicides in this country. Roughly 7,000 blacks are murdered each year, and 90% of them are killed by their peers. There is your epidemic. In New York, which is one of the safer big cities in the US, blacks are about 23% of the population, but commit 75% of all shootings. Whites are 34% of the population in New York and commit less than 2% of the shootings in the city. And this is not a New York phenomenon. You'll find similar numbers in Detroit, Cleveland, Oakland, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and other large cities. In fact, homicide is the leading cause of death for young black men in the US. And it's not because cops are killing them. Bad cops should be called out and punished, and I think the activists are performing a public service when they call attention to police misconduct. The problem is the overemphasis on police behavior. If you believe that these lives really matter, if you want to reduce that black body count, just as a practical matter, should your focus be on the 2% of black shooting deaths that involve police, or the 98% that don't? This national discussion about race and crime is important because the violence that is so prevalent in these neighborhoods has enormous social and economic consequences as well. The common assumption is that poverty leads to crime, but the truth is closer to the reverse of that. Businesses flee crime-ridden neighborhoods. Jobs follow. Property values fall. One reason that blacks are progressing at a much faster rate in the first half of the 20th century, as I talked about earlier, when black political power was minimal and racism was legal and widespread, is that black communities back then were much less violent. I think it's also important to note that the level of social pathology that we see in black ghettos today is not normal. Things have not always been this way. Here's William Julius Wilson, the black sociologist, describing Harlem and other poor black neighborhoods back in the 1940s and 50s. Wilson writes that despite the high crime rate, Wilson writes that despite the high rate of poverty in these black neighborhoods throughout the first half of the 20th century, the rates of inner-city joblessness, teenage pregnancy, out-of-wedlock births, female-headed families, welfare dependency, and serious crime were significantly lower in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, and did not reach catastrophic proportions until the 1970s. He writes that there was crime, but it had not reached the point where people were fearful of walking the streets at night. There was joblessness, but it was nowhere near the unemployment rates we saw in ghetto communities beginning in the 1970s, said Wilson. There were single-parent families, but they were a small minority of all black families, and tended to be headed not by unwed teenagers, but by middle-aged women who were widowed or divorced. There were welfare recipients, but only a very small percentage of families could be said to be welfare dependent, he writes. In short, he says, unlike the present period, inner-city neighborhoods prior to 1960 exhibited a sense of community and explicit norms and sanctions against aberrant behavior. What Wilson is describing leads to a very unsettling conclusion, which is that blacks living under Jim Crow conditions and only a couple generations out of slavery had more stable families and lived in safer communities than blacks living under a twice-elected black president. Let me close by saying this. Most sensible people agree that racial prejudice not only still exists in this country, but does in fact impact a group's progress. The relevant question is to what extent does racism explain these racial gaps? The gaps we see in poverty, employment, crime, education, and so forth. And to what extent can other factors explain them more plausibly? I don't think our politicians and policymakers spend enough time considering the non-racial factors, and that's the problem. Downplaying group behavioral differences or shielding people from any responsibility for their situation may seem like the charitable thing to do in light of all the atrocities that blacks have endured in this country. But the relevant question is whether it's helpful. More than anything else, the black underclass needs the human capital, the values, the habits, the attitudes, the behaviors that facilitate economic advancement regardless of who gets elected. A previous generation of black leaders understood this. An unprecedented black advancement was the result. Let's hope this history informs our current policy debates about inequality. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we have time for some questions if anyone has any for me. Yep.
So if, as you said, the answer to these problems isn't political activity or social or economic
Well, in terms of public policy and what the government can do, I think it's a matter of what they need to stop doing. I wrote a book called Please Stop Helping Us. And the title is referring to a lot of the Great Society programs that were intended to help the black underclass that, in fact, have not only not helped, but in some cases, I would argue, hindered. Created things like welfare dependency, kept kids trapped in the worst performing schools in the system. We're in an Institute of Higher Education. I'll take affirmative action in higher education as an example. Here's a program intended to increase the ranks of the black middle class, increase the number of black professionals. We've had this policy in place for more than 40 years now. And we've also had some natural experiments take place over that period. One is out in California, the University of California system, which back in the mid-1990s banned the use of racial preferences in college admissions. So what happened after that ban took effect? The rate of black college graduation in the University of California system doubled after affirmative action was ended. The same happened for Hispanics. And it didn't just double across all disciplines and all majors. It doubled in the toughest majors, engineering, computer science, math, and so forth. So a policy that had been put in place to help increase the ranks of the black middle class was in practice resulting in fewer architects and engineers and lawyers than we would have had in the absence of the policy. And that's because perverse incentives were put in place. Kids were steered into schools they were unprepared to be matriculating in. And so you had higher dropout rates, or you had them switching to easier majors and so forth. There was a study done some years ago of kids at MIT, black kids at MIT, scored in the 90th percentile in the math portion of the SAT. Talk about some pretty smart kids. But they were in the bottom 10% among their peers at MIT. So kids that would have been hitting it out of the park at a less selective institution were struggling at MIT. And therefore, many of them were dropping out or switching to majors, to easier majors. So again, and we could go down the list of any number of policies. The minimum wage has been sold as an anti-poverty measure. What it does in practice is price less skilled, less experienced people out of jobs. If you look at who's poor in America, if you look at the snapshots of these families, what's missing is not someone who makes more than minimum wage. What's missing are workers making anything. And to the extent that you have a minimum wage policy in place, pricing people out of the labor force, making them too expensive to hire, you are not addressing poverty. What poor families need are workers. So again, for me, the solution would start with two things. One, having an honest discussion about what the real problem is. And secondly, reevaluating some of these efforts, some of these programs that have been put in place over the years to help. Yes?
In what particular area of daily life do you see maybe minority groups failing to live up to personal responsibility? Like something related to friendship or duties or family life?
Well, you can look at the single the percentage of single moms out there is evidence of black men having kids and not taking care of them. That alone, and maybe the most significant one. I mean, if you want to know why these kids are running around Chicago shooting at each other, they don't have any fathers. They have no idea what it means to be a man. The gang life has replaced that. That is a function of absent fathers in those communities. And so that I think that would be the most significant example of this, of the phenomenon I'm talking about. Yes.
How are your ideas being accepted, or how are these ideas?
They're not. No, the problem is that the what is to be gained by saying the things I'm saying? If you are a civil rights organization, if you are an activist, if you are a politician trying to win votes, what is to be gained? If you're a politician, you win votes by telling people what they want to hear, telling them that all of their problems are the results of someone else, and particularly if you play this identity politics, and you're addressing black constituents, telling them that all of their problems are the fault of other people in general and other white people in particular, helps get them to the polls and vote for you. If you are a black activist, saying this helps you raise money. If you are a civil rights leader, saying this helps keep your organization relevant. If basic civil rights are no longer a real issue in America, if the civil rights battles have been fought and won for the most part, what use do we have for an NAACP? So they are never going to acknowledge that this fight is over. And so that's what you have to ask yourself. It's people, responding to incentives. And frankly, there is a very lucrative racial grievance industry in this country. And there are a lot of people in on it.
So is no one interested in the fact that 72% of all black children are born out of wedlock? Is that not, can't you just connect those dots and see that this is just a huge issue?
Well, it's a growing issue. It's actually been stabilized among blacks. It's growing among whites.
Stabilized at 72%?
Well, I mean, it hasn't been going up. There was a period when it was really rising dramatically, but it hasn't been rising significantly. It's kind of flattened. But that could be a function of marriage not being in vogue anymore for anybody in the country. I mean, many other factors are going on there. But my point is there is a growing single parenting issue in white America right now. And we see what's going on in black America, so it does not bode well for the country. Yes, in the back.
You mentioned that there were times when legally instituted racism and white racism, and there have been plenty of ethnic groups that have come to America and faced discrimination and done quite well. I was really struck in your presentation. I don't think you used the word slavery. You used the word atrocity at one point.
Yeah.
But I didn't hear you use the word slavery, and I can't get my mind around what slavery would have been like or what it would do to a people. And I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
I have no idea. I'm younger than you are. I mean, it's not. I didn't know any slaves.
Well, I didn't own any slaves
I don't know
either.
how I would have any insight into it.
Yeah.
I mean, my point with regard to slavery, slavery is used by some as sort of the legacy of slavery is this all-purpose explanation for all bad black outcomes in America, the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. And one of the reasons I wanted to go through in some detail that history of what was happening between the end of slavery and the Great Society interventions of the 1960s. I'm talking about a long period there, a couple generations. So let's talk about the progress that was being made there. And you look at that, you look at the rate at which blacks are increasing their years of education, incomes, home ownership rates between the early 1900s and the 1940s and 50s, and then somewhere along the line this starts to stall and reverse course. And someone comes to you up in 1988 or 2018 or 2019 and says, this is due to the legacy of slavery, you go, wait a minute.
You-
Did the legacy skip a couple
You-
generations
you
and then
said
reassert itself?
You said that racism was, legally enshrined, and you said that it continues to exist. It may never go away.
I don't
And
expect to live to see the day when there's
Has there
no
ever
longer
been an
any-
actual apology?
Has
Has there been an apology for slavery?
I don't. Black people don't need an apology. They need jobs.
They don't need an apology.
What is the apology going to do? An apology from who? Nobody here owned any slaves. Why are you apologizing? What are you apologizing for?
Yeah.
In fact, most of the descendants in America, people in America today, aren't even descendants of slaveholders.
Yeah.
I mean, why
John
would
Paul
you
II.
owe black people an apology?
John Paul II, for example, apologized for things that had been done in the name of the Catholic Church long
And what
before he
was
was
the- what was
long
the
before he was born.
Benefit of this?
I guess
What,
it's the idea that you're
who is
set.
better off because of this?
I guess it's the idea that you're setting something right. You're acknowledging.
An apology isn't going to set anything right.
Yeah.
What's done is done, though. History. There's nothing to be done. I mean, Shelby Steele has this great line of, when he wrote about slavery reparations. He said something to the effect of, "Slavery can be endured and overcome. It cannot be repaid."
I wasn't talking about reparations. I was just talking about an apology.
I don't know to what again, the problem here is that all the slaves are gone and all the slave holders are gone. Who is owed an apology and who is beholden to offer one? I don't. John Paul II? I don't follow the logic. Yes.
About identity politics in general. It seems like, so in principle, I'm agreed with the idea that more top-down bureaucratic response to this is not going to fix it, and in fact, maybe encourage the problem as it currently exists. I'm thinking, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and him, the clarion calls that he was talking about, the fracture of the black family, and the idea what social services were going to do that, and incentivizing lack of getting married, and he's ignored. So
not just ignored, he was castigated.
He shut it down as well.
Someone asked earlier, just to interrupt for a second, about why no one says these things. And Daniel Patrick Moynihan was the canary in the coal mine on a lot of this. And we lost decades of social science research because nobody wanted to even touch this because of what happened to Moynihan. He was pilloried. And you slowly have today a few more sociologists. I quoted William Julius Wilson and others, Orlando Patterson, who's at Harvard, saying it's ridiculous that we can't talk about the role that culture plays in these racial gaps. This is the elephant in the room, and no one wants to talk about it. No one's wanted to talk about it. And they said, we have to talk about this. And you do see a few academics coming forward. Now, there's a younger generation that's more willing to talk about it, too. But for decades, really, in the wake of what happened to Moynihan, nobody wanted to have an honest discussion about behavior leading to these outcomes. It was all considered blaming the victim. Or you're a racist, you're blaming the victim. Let's talk about something else.
Is the problem, so what if we had more Moynihans and less LBJs who are devising the public policy initiative, right? So Moynihan's a bright guy. He saw the cultural implications of the public policy initiative. Is the problem public policy, or is it that the black vote has been largely one party, and that one party has a certain kind of public policy it puts into place for the last 50 years?
I think it's both, but your latter point is an important one, that the left has done a very good job on selling blacks on big government, and that government is a solution to the problems you face. And that helps them get elected, and they continue to push that. And a lot of blacks believe it. I've spoken to groups of very accomplished blacks, from the elite university, a room full of Barack and Michelle Obamas, just top-notch schools, top-notch degrees, hugely successful law firm partners, all that. they're convinced they only exist because of affirmative action. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for affirmative action. And you go, do you know what blacks were doing before affirmative action? Do you know how fast blacks were entering middle-class professions prior to affirmative action? Do you know what happened after California ended affirmative action? They have no knowledge of this, or just refused. Those numbers can't be right. But the left has done a very, very good job of convincing blacks that they need, and that's why when blacks hear small government, less government, they're thinking of everything. They're not talking about, oh, I won't get a welfare check. They're thinking post office jobs, military jobs, all of these professions populated by a disproportionate number of blacks linked to the government. And Democrats know that too. And so when they go, he's talking about small government, my opponent, you know what that means. It works. It works on the psychology. But I think it's both factors. Yes.
In light of the upcoming 2020 election, you have on the Democratic side, you have about 20 candidates, and yet, thank you. And yet, at the same time, there's been many reports and articles made that, especially minority groups, can't seem to really identify with any particular candidate. Even people such as Kamala Harris or Pete Buttigieg, who run from the minority platforms. My question is, what would those candidates, what would be in their, not just in their interest, but for those groups in light of the election and getting people to come out to the polls?
I'm not sure of how, what,
They, my subject is coming to the idea that people don't feel that they identify with any one candidate, or they don't know
from
what
what
to.
I've read, Biden is doing pretty well among blacks, and I would attribute that to his affiliation with Obama. So from all the polls I've seen, both national polls and in the early primary states, particularly South Carolina, he seems to be their top candidate right now. I don't know if it'll stay that way, but that seems to be the case now, which is a progress of sorts in that there are other blacks in the race that black people could be vetting, but right now race doesn't seem to be the the deciding factor in who they're interested in supporting at this point.
So I'm sure a lot of people talk to you about your opinion on President Donald Trump, but specifically, given the triumphs that President Trump has had, especially with the First Step Act, getting incarcerated African Americans out of prison and getting minorities out of prison, as well as working with famous black leaders across the country to bring billions of dollars back into African American communities and impoverished communities. Are African Americans realizing that this is actually happening because of, the censorship that, the media?
Well, I have a couple responses. To answer your second question first, no. Trump has said and done too much other stuff, starting with the birtherism. He's lost black. I mean, that issue alone lost him. I tell audiences that I initially thought if there was an opening for Trump in the black community, partly based on the popularity of his show among black audiences, and it was just a very, very popular show, and if you blacks liked the bling. They liked it. He liked nice things. He liked to surround himself with nice things, and he wasn't afraid to show it off. And that resonated. And so I thought he was someone who could go into these communities and say, "I'm a businessman. I'm a developer. I can tell you why there's so many empty lots in this part of town. I can tell you, I can do something about this." And go. That wasn't his strategy for winning the election. He didn't think he needed that vote. He thought Romney left too many whites at home, and that he could focus on getting them out, and in politics, it's trade-offs like anything else. Time spent courting one group is time not spent courting another group you might have a better chance with. So no, I mean, Trump can talk about the unemployment rates and the rest, the First Step Act. I'm not a big fan of the First Step Act. There were some things in there I liked on prison reentry programs. If we're going to lock as many people up as we lock up in this country, we need to, most of them are going to get out one day, and we need to be doing something to make sure that they can reassimilate in society. And so to the extent that we can do a better job of that, I'm all for it. But I didn't have any problems with the length of drug sentencing and all the rest, and I think there's a lot of revisionist history going on there with those history. I mean, the same, people forget that we ended up with these lengthy prison terms because of the crack epidemic in the 1980s. And leading the fight to put in place these longer sentences was the Congressional Black Caucus, because it was their constituents, their communities that were being devastated by this. Most of the Congressional Black Caucus supported these lengthy, these crazy ratios of crack to powder. And you should go talk to some of the people who live in these communities. Again, they are the primary victims of violent crime. You go talk to them and ask them if they think they're better off if this guy gets to come home sooner rather than later, because he's coming right back to that neighborhood. I remember Hillary Clinton being on the campaign, people are in prison too long, we should let them out sooner. They're not headed to her neighborhood when they get out. Hillary Clinton lives in one of the whitest, safest communities. It's a suburb of New York City. In America. For all intent and purposes, there is no violent crime where Hillary Clinton lives. And when these guys get out, they are not headed in to her neighborhood. They are headed right back to the same ghettos to raise hell. And go ask those people if they want those guys coming home sooner rather than later. I mean, my sympathies are really with the victims of these crimes, not the criminals. And I'm not convinced that that our jails are full of innocent people. And the other thing I'll say about the drug stuff, because I get this a lot, is you have two arguments that are made. One is a sort of anti-mass incarceration argument. We just lock too many people up in this country, and we need to reduce the number of people we lock up, most in the Western world or in the developed world. And the other is they think that doing that going after the drug war or ending the drug war, will reduce racial disparities in the prison system. And I don't think the facts bear either of those claims out. Blacks are about 13% of the population. They're about 37% of the prison population. And I'm talking about the state and local prison population, which houses about 90% of the inmates in the country. There's a separate federal system, houses about 10%. But in the state and local system, again, blacks are about 37% of the population. If you were to snap your fingers and send home everyone in prison who was there for a drug offense, black or white, blacks would still make up about 36 or 37% of the prison population. Because drug offenses aren't driving the incarceration rate. Violent offenses are driving the incarceration rate. The latest figures I saw are, I think, from 2016. I think it was 54% of people incarcerated are there for violent crimes. 19% are there for property crimes. 15% are there for drug offenses. And only 5% of the drug offenders are there for possession. The others are traffickers. So if we were to send home everyone who's in prison for a drug offense, oh, by the way, and if you did that, U.S. would still have the largest prison population in the Western world. So you would neither solve your mass incarceration issue nor solve your racial disparity issue by ending the drug war. Now, there are great arguments for ending the drug war. I'm kind of indifferent. I mean, is it working? Does it make sense to continue it? Blah, blah, blah. Those are great arguments to make. But if your goal is to either reduce racial disparities in the prison population or to end mass incarceration in America, ending the drug war is not going to get you toward any of those objectives. So the first step stuff I'm kind of indifferent to. But as a pitch to blacks for their votes, no, that I don't think that's going to do it for Trump.
So like even though he was, I believe it was in the 80s or the 90s, he received like the same award along with Muhammad Ali and Rosa Parks, and then he was a proud, he was a good friend of Jesse
He probably made a
James.
donation to the organization. I mean, that's typically what happens. But I think I know what you're talking about. I think it was an NAACP award or something like that. Yeah.
So it's just, I thought it was just sad that they just blacklisted him, afterwards, even though he had, those connections.
Is that,
I'd like to ask one.
Sure.
It would be easy to walk away from your presentation today thinking that what we've heard is a counsel of despair.
It is.
That this is a mess and there's nothing to do about it. Without trying to get too utopian here,
Yeah.
What would be basic small steps that Americans of goodwill could take to improve the situation? The first thing is do no harm. That is, you want
Right,
get
there's do no harm.
government should
Yeah.
stop doing a lot of the bad things
right,
they're doing.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Besides that, other things, other suggestions?
I really just wish we could have honest conversations about the problems. I mean, how many people, when I cited the stats on police shootings in America and the reduction in them over the past 40 years, how many were familiar with that already? Okay, very good. Because it's so easy to find. The police departments post this on their websites. You can go look it up. How many people did police shoot in 2016? Among the departments that keep these figures, they're not hard to find. It's never reported. Every police shooting is treated like this happens all the time. It's never put in context. And when the media wants to put something in context, they do it. If we have an illegal immigrant commit a violent act or kill someone, they will remind you over and over again how rare this is. They will put it all in. And they're right, it is rare. But they take the time to explain that to people. But when we have a police shooting, there's another one. It just happens every day. And there's no context there. And again, so we need to have honest conversations. I'll give you one more statistic that to me speaks to how early the problem starts and versus where we start to talk about the problem. And I'll give you, so there's some studies out. I think Robert Putnam at Harvard put one study out on the number of words children hear per hour at home. And it comes down to, if you're a child of professional parents in America, you hear about 2,100 words per hour at home. If you're a child of working class parents, you hear about 1,200. And if you're a child of a family on welfare, you hear about 600. And by the way, the words you hear from the professionals are overwhelmingly positive words. Words that you hear from a welfare family are mostly negative. It might not seem like a huge difference in numbers, but what it means is that over the years, a 10-year-old child of a family on welfare will not have heard as many words as a 3-year-old child of professionals. Now, you hear a stat like that, and then you turn around and listen to us having a debate about whether the SAT is racist. Do you know how far downstream that is occurring? Why would you expect these different groups to score similarly on the SAT? I mean, you've got, even before you get there, you've got debates over selective high schools in New York City or other places where we don't have enough racial balance in the kids that are trying to get into these schools. We have these gifted and talented programs. We don't have enough racial balance. Must mean that the program is, or the administrators of it are racist, or there's something wrong with the test. go back to the original. You see, it starts before the kids are even in school. And the idea that we're looking 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, and saying, that must be due to, that racial inequality is due to racism. This racial inequality is due to racism. It's as if this is otherworldly. And we don't really have honest discussions about where these inequalities begin and what drives them. Are we out of time, or should I
No,
go?
we got
Well,
plenty of time.
I'll give you one personal example too, and this speaks to, it's another cultural issue, and if you're that working class black child or welfare recipient, or let alone the from the family on welfare, this is another problem you might encounter. So shortly after I started working at the Wall Street Journal, I went back home to Buffalo, New York, where I was born and raised, and was visiting my sister, my older sister, and chatting with her niece. It's back in the mid-'90s. Her niece would have been, or my niece would have been maybe 6 or 7 at the time, second grader. So we're waiting for dinner, and I'm chatting with her about school and favorite subjects and all that, and she stops me mid-sentence. And she says, "Uncle Jason, why you talk white?" And then she turned to her little friend next to her, said, Don't my uncle sound white? Why are you trying to sound so smart?" Now they laughed and had a little chuckle at my expense, and I wasn't entirely surprised by it. It's something I'd gotten when I was a kid myself. It's called the acting white issue in the black community. Everyone's talking about it. Obama's talked about it. Michelle's talked about it. It's a real issue. But what my niece said really stuck to me. You know, here are 2 girls, 6 or 7 years old, recently had learned to ride bicycles, already linking speech patterns to race and intelligence. Think about that. I mean, it's sort of remarkable how early this starts. And that might be occurring no matter how many words they're hearing in the house, if they still have that mentality when they leave the house, or because of the subculture they're learning their value system from. So it's another self-inflicted wound that is going to be aside and apart from whether we can vanquish racism in America. If an appreciation for education, an appreciation, you have the best school in the world down the street. If you don't have an appreciation for learning and education, it's not going to do you much good. So again, these are, I think, people always say, what can we do? What can the government do? Most of this is going to be self-improvement. And the best I can hope for the government is to not get in the way and to stop doing things that aren't working.
With respect to cultural issues outside of government, at one time, somebody might have said that the black churches were a resource for this.
Yeah.
Are they still a resource for this? How much have they been?
They are. The problem is black church attendance. It's not only down, but it's the women who go, and who you want to reach are the men. And that's what the clergy will tell you, the ministers will tell you. They want to reach the men. It's women are filling the pews, and that's part of the problem. But the church is still a respected institution within the community if you can get people to show up.
Are there many black ministers who will talk about
They do
sex
all the
outside
time.
of marriage?
Oh yeah, in the church. If I were giving this talk in front of a group of black men, as I've done, they're completely unfazed. Black people often talk about this way amongst themselves. They just don't do it in front of white people. And I'm not being facetious here. There are conversations blacks have in front of one another, and conversations that they have in front of whites. Obama, as president, to his credit, talked a lot about personal responsibility and absent fathers. He spoke at historically black colleges. He gave commencement speeches. He talked about this. He talked about not having a father himself growing up and how he tried to compensate for that with his current marriage and being a father himself. And he would get slammed by liberals for doing this, particularly the black left. Ta-Nehisi Coates ripped the president apart for talking this way, blaming the victim, condescending, elitism. But yes, I mean, what Obama was saying is said all the time, every Sunday in churches across the country. It's not a big deal. It's not a big deal.
Thank you very much, Jason. Really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.